Thank you very much, Katrina. Just in case anyone is confused, I'm William Casey, and beside me is Gerald O'Brien. And for those of you who don't know Gerald, he's a native of Skibbereen, and I think nobody knows more, about Skibbereen than Gerald, really. He's the font of all things Skibbereen and president of our society as well. So, Gerald, I'll start by asking you, where and when did this meeting occur in Skibbereen?
Thank you, William. Where on the top of Curra Hill, on the other side of town, northwest a little bit, and the date was June 22nd, 1843.
And I believe you have a personal connection to that site, Gerald.
Well, it was on my great-grandfather's land that the platform stood, and I heard about that. Two things I heard about it from very early in my life. First of all, that the meeting took place up there, and secondly, that Daniel O'Connell was shouldered up on a boat. He wasn't asked to climb the hill. He was shouldered up on a boat, no shortage of men. There were 8 million people in the country that time, and I'm sure he had enough each side of him, they didn't feel his weight.
So maybe before we get into the monster meeting, you might tell us a bit about O'Connell and his life.
Yes. Well, Daniel O'Connell was one of the O'Connells of Derrynane, a very old family, going back to the age of Gaelic aristocracy. The main man in his life was not his father, but his uncle, an Uncle Morris, who was known as Hunting Cap. I suppose he wore his hunting cap a lot. And it was pretty obvious from an early stage of his life that this was no ordinary young man. So I'll make some little effort to show how this Daniel O'Connell became the Daniel O'Connell. There was one event which exposed him to languages. At that time, it was quite common that the son of a landlord, which he was, of course, or the nephew of a landlord, when he'd be a small infant, would be more or less farmed out to a reliable couple on the estate to more or less rear him from being child. And these people he was sent to live with were fully Irish speaking. So that was his cradle language. First was Irish. Then he would have English from all the other people around him. And he had French also from the French smuggling boat, smuggling wine into Kerry. He picked it up from French sailors. So that when he left to go to school at about 12 or 13, he had 3 languages already. He and his brother, Morris also, went first to a school in Cove, and after a while there, they were sent to one in France called Saint-Omer, a fine college in France, and they went from Saint-Omer to Douai, also in France. And of course, everyone will know that that particular house produced an English translation of the Old Testament in 1609. So it was a fine house, and everything went fine there. The reports coming back on Daniel did say that he was exhibiting strange characteristics, and prophetically that he would make a great figure in society. About his brother, they said he was a polite young man with nothing particular remarkable about him. And like many nice people, nobody even knows his name now. So that was it. Anyway, they had an abrupt end to their time in France because when Louis XIV was executed, their uncle, who was a count in the French service, a general and a count, he told them to get away from France straight away because the revolution was going ahead. In any case, had they stayed, that university, Douai, was suppressed before the end of the year by the revolutionary government in Paris, so they would have had to leave anyway. Daniel then came into London and entered the King's Inn and studied law there. And he specialized in criminal and constitutional jurisprudence, a course which fitted him well for the two venues of his life, the courtrooms and the floor of the House of Commons. And needless to say, he was very receptive to everything he was taught. He did practice, but he did politics as well. Now, I must mention there was an event in his life pretty early. He was 39 years old. He participated in a duel. And it should be mentioned because it affected his character, I would think, too long. It started, like a lot of these things, fairly innocuously. I don't think Daniel was on the Dublin Corporation at the time, but he described them as a beggarly Dublin Corporation. What he was talking about there, of course, was their resistance to disbursing money, which is true of all such bodies. They'll give you many smiles, but when it comes to paying out hard cash, it's quite something else. So anyway, he got a letter from one member of the Dublin Corporation demanding an apology. This was from a man called John Norcott de Stair, French name, but he was a retired officer out of the Royal Navy, this man was. Anyway, O'Connell was in no mood to apologise because he didn't mention any member by name or that. So the thing brewed on, and next thing, de Stair was chasing him into the forecourts with a whip, which didn't look well, and it blew hot and blew cold, and in the end it came to a duel between the two of them, where it was a place called Bishop's Court on the Dublin-Kildare border when, 1st of February 1815, with snow on the ground. Now, it wasn't exactly like a shootout at the OK Corral, because you had two gentlemen here fighting a duel which was governed by strict rules and all that. His second, that was the man who would be assisting him. His second was a man called McNamara, I think a military officer with some experience in ballistics. So the first thing he said to the Liberator was to remove the white cravat on his neck, because it seemingly presented too easy a target. And then there was quite a crowd gathering, and among those, the Liberator recognised his Dublin tailor, of all people. Not alone did he recognise him, but acknowledged him. And he said, Jerry, he said, I never missed you from an aggregate meeting. So, strangely then, the thing dragged on, and he asked McNamara at some stage to say no more to him. He had a big thing coming ahead. Of the two, de Stair was by far the greater shot. A handkerchief was dropped. The guns were discharged simultaneously, according to witnesses. And if de Stair was a good shot, he wasn't doing well that day because he hit the ground beside the Liberator. O'Connell aimed for his thigh, not wishing to be a widowmaker himself. And de Stair survived, and they dispersed. But there had been internal bleeding, and de Stair died the next day. So, it has been said, as the law stood at the time, O'Connell was vulnerable to a murder charge, but nobody ever preferred it. It wasn't brought on. He did have a black glove that some people said he wore on his right hand. He hated killing that man. And I have seen that black glove up in Derrynane, but some biographers discount that he wore it all the time, but he kept it anyway, and it did have a profound effect on him. And the next thing then, of course, before he went fully into politics, was known as the defiant speech he made in Doneraile. No, sorry, that was in Mallow, that was later. No, this was, I'll tell you what it was now. It was a number of people had conspired to kill 3 landlords, I think. And one of them was supposed to have had a charmed life because they tried to shoot him in his house reading and it hit his lamp and that. Anyway, they were charged with murder and 3 to 4 were convicted and sentenced to death. And then the way the court was going, there were lesser players in the thing being charged. And one of these, the brother of one of the fellows so charged, was a William Burke, and was being done in Cork, in the county courthouse in Cork, which that time was where the Queen's Old Castle later was, not the one on Washington Street at the moment. That's where the courts were being heard that time. So anyway, it was agreed there was only one man in all of Ireland could save the others, and that was O'Connell. The court was adjourned on Saturday till Monday. So this William Burke rode all the way 90 miles from Cork City up to Derrynane and arrived at the Liberator's breakfast table on Sunday morning. O'Connell he took the brief. He said he would defend them. He saddled up a horse for the first 20 miles as far as Kinmare. They had a coach then with 3 changes of horses between Kinmare and Cork City, and he arrived into the courtroom and, of course, defended them. He wasn't very long in when he tore the evidence of prosecution witnesses to pieces. Some of them were spies, more of them were accomplices, and it is said sometimes that he saved 115 people. He didn't. He said about 15. The people already sentenced were commuted to transportation. And it was his last great triumph in the courtrooms. There's no doubt about it. But the way he turned, nobody else could have done it. He did it, and that was 1829, and 2 years after that he took silk in the English bar, 1831, but after that it was politics. O'Connell had 2 great issues in his life in politics. One was the repeal of the Catholic emancipation, the acts by which the Catholics were deprived and disabled. They were being whittled away before O'Connell, but there was still a major piece of legislation required to remove them altogether. And he organized a campaign there, which was the first of its kind anywhere in the world. He initiated, this was from about 1818 or so, he initiated the Catholic rent, which was the earliest known example of crowdfunding. The rate was a farthing per week, a shilling, a penny per month, and 12 pennies made 1 shilling per year. Now, it was pretty small at the time, but it did fund his activities, and he did secure Catholic emancipation. And that would be his great, great success. Now, his second project was repeal of the Act of Union, which came into force in 1801. That was shortly after the United Irish Rebellion of 1798, in which 30,000, by the way, were killed. And he may have misjudged the repeal one. It started much later because there was way, way more resistance in England to agreeing to what they perceived as a dismemberment of the British Empire. He did not ask for he did not ask for a republic. That wasn't in his thinking at all. Grattan's Parliament had been given full legislative powers from 1782. He wasn't asking for a restoration of Grattan's Parliament because that was only for Protestants. He wanted it elected on the basis which would have been predominantly Catholic. Anyway, it was resisted. But before that, having built up the thing, he started the campaign of monster meetings. They were very well organised, and thanks to my great friend Philip O'Regan, just days before this talk, he gave me a copy of a letter that originally the O'Connell meeting in Skib was due to take place on Monday, the 19th of June of 1843. It ended up on June the 22nd, which was Thursday. It's very enlightening because from it I would gather that most of the groundwork for the monster meetings devolved upon the local supporters of Repeal. Now, the three individuals I would say from the research I've done who really prepared everything for the Skib meeting was Daniel Mccarthy, who was then living in Lochine Lodge, but he was also building a mansion of his over in Glencurra, which was burned in the 1920s. I'm amazed in 1843 because I think Glencurra was well advanced that time, but his address was given out at Lake Lodge in Lochine. The other man was Timothy McCarthy Downing, a solicitor.
Of course, McCarthy would have been owners of the brewery in Skibbereen.
He was, yes. He was the owner of the brewery. And they were immensely wealthy people altogether. When they were in the heyday in Glencurra, they would never spend a winter here. It would be either Italy or the south of France. They were extremely wealthy people altogether. And then Timothy McCarthy Downing was a Kerryman himself, and he was on it. And the other man was Dr. Morris Power, which I'll tell you about him later. So, interestingly there, it was all ready when he came, and when the Liberator came to speak on Currahill, he stayed with Father Doheny, Father Michael Doheny, parish priest of Dunmanway the night before. And the parade into town was organised at a Drumeen bridge between Dunmanway and Drumaleague. And it's very interesting there because it is very well documented. Now, what is amazing, they had parades, and in that parade, they had all the trade groups parading themselves. Now, why were tradesmen so interested in repeal? For the very compelling reason that their livelihoods had contracted because the union, the Act of Union of 1800 was a disaster for the Irish economy. It depressed agriculture, all the traders in the towns. So you had people like the tailors were parading at this, and on their banner they had an image of Adam and Eve. That was their image. In other words, that's what put us in business, they might have said that way. They were all sorts. They were harness makers, rope makers, nailers, all these people. So the crowd was enormous coming down, and they paraded down, and he was carried up to Currahill. And of course, as regards the choice of site there, if you consider Tara, it had a, right.
Why Skibbereen in the first place, not Currahill?
Well, no. He spoke at Mallow 11 days before Skib, and as it happens, because of the defiant nature of his speech in Mallow, he was modifying Mallow a bit from Currahill when he got...
But you might just give us what did he say at Mallow there was?
It was, well, he made the point, one point he made about the possibility of rebellion, that the American colonies had chased out the English with a population of 3 million, and he had 9 million in Southern Ireland. He used that to the figures. Furthermore, it is interesting, in the parades to these meetings, the men paraded in military form, 4 abreast.
Yeah.
They were going down that way, you see. And it was purely a matter of putting pressure on Westminster to agree. But there was no relenting, particularly after Sir Robert Peel was elected Prime Minister. He was his greatest foe politically, by the way, Peel was.
Yeah.
And yet even Peel conceded that the Lion had something. He was known as the Lion, O'Connell. He was a prodigy. He was a prodigy, there's no doubt about it. So that was the campaign, and it was going very high and continued to go highly after Skibbereen until Clontarf.
Why come to West Carbery and Skibbereen? Was there any...
Well, now, I've been looking through the list, and you had parades from Clonakilty, Dunmanway, of course, Drimoleague, and Bantry. Yeah. It may have had something to do with its focal position. Now, I will say, and 'tis relevant to your question, that at the end of the banquet, the very last thing, one of the representatives from Macroom got up in the Temperance Hall and asked the Liberator to give us a similar one in Macroom. Yep. So, as far as I know, it was certainly, in fact, it was the only time the Liberator had entered the Carberries, was that visit to Skibbereen. And it must have been picked, and what you cannot discount also would be the influence of McCarthy Downing, and Morris Power on him.
Very,
So I think that's what brought it round, that Skib was the chosen venue. It was an enormous demonstration altogether.
It's a huge population. How many people do you think were at the...
Well, now that's much disputed. Of course, some of the more colourful reports said 500,000. I think, and then the people who didn't want repeal tried to cut it down. I think myself, you would be safe, 'twas certainly in excess of 100,000. 120, maybe 130, and far, far the biggest gathering of human beings ever in the Island Valley.
I would say ever in West Cork.
Oh, yes, yeah. And possibly very difficult to anticipate anything like it again because of the way people move around, you know, and all that.
Yeah.
So we got a very good account of the banquet was held in the Temperance Hall.
The speech itself, that he came to Skibbereen, he said all these tradespeople.
Yes.
The speech was up in Glencora. Why Glencora? Why was that spot picked as the...
Well, now, I actually have tried to tease that out in my head. And my feeling would be that Daniel Mccarthy was building a mansion under it. Yeah. And he would have been going back and forth to the place for maybe a month or several months. Yeah. And I would say it was he threw out the idea of Currahill, and that would explain it because he was building a huge mansion under it for himself in the wood of Glencora. And many people believe that that was the site of a McCarthy castle many, many years ago. Yeah. And, of course, the implication is McCarthy was somehow descended to those people, from those people. Yes. I think that was it. It was Daniel McCarthy. He said, this would be a good spot.
This is my
I doubt. That's the most likely one. Yeah, the most likely one.
It was also an elevated site, wasn't it?
Oh, yeah, and it had the elevation as also at Tara.
Yes.
You know, and the optics are there for the optics because he was this great prophet. Coming, and they never saw anything like him before. I haven't seen this in print, but I've heard it betimes that they had people up on the hedges passing it by voice along. And I'm not altogether discounting that, because in that era now, a man had a great mansion, as many of them had in the country, and if he had a fire, there was no fire brigade at the next village or town. So one of the ways of fighting a fire was all the able-bodied men he could get standing, passing buckets of water to each other. And the Royal Navy also used that thing about the semaphore codes, that you would get great speed of velocity without winding, the people involved. Yeah. And it's quite likely, And you see, we must remember there were people now listening to a speech being delivered on Currahill up in Cloverhill, which is over near where the hospital is, and some form of that was engaged in, all right, to hear what he was saying before reading it on the papers.
Yeah. So people, basically, there were people strategically
along that way.
So
yes.
they would hear deliberately.
They were.
They'd
yes.
pass on the word.
They would.
Then somebody else would hear it and pass on the
and
word.
it would travel very quickly. And like anything, they would have achieved expertise at this.
Yeah.
So you see, old technology was the necessity, was the mother of invention. That was it.
Yeah,
they
I
got
often kind of wondered,
yes.
Paul Connell said good morning up there. What did they hear?
Mutations in translation or lost in translation, always possible. And given the excitement of the event too,
yes.
always
and
possible.
A lot of, a huge din from the crowd. And
that's right. That's
Another
right.
thing about the speech was, what language was it given in?
Almost both languages.
Yeah.
He first of all kicked off in Irish, and he was switching from Irish to English. And of course, the report I read was written in English in the Cork Examiner, because they didn't print Irish. But the vast bulk of people were bilingual this time. We're talking now 2 years before the famine, 1843, 1845, and you had a much richer, more diverse Ireland that time.
Yeah,
that's
a very different Ireland.
Different, much more peopled, much more peopled.
But and what was the tone of like you said in Mallow, he was very...
The tone was conciliatory, not so much by the people giving him the addresses of welcome and that, but his own tone was deliberately conciliatory, because I think he may have got tip-offs that the castle didn't like what they heard from Mallow. And he had to keep them all on hands. He was treading a very delicate game,
So he was...
it was conciliatory. And, of course, 3 cheers for the Queen. He was a royalist all the time. He had no issue with the royalty at all. No, not at all.
Of course,
and another thing, a little indicator, he said once he didn't care if any of his sons joined the British forces, because 2/3 of the army and navy were already Irish. That's what it was nothing unusual. Yeah, that's it.
So nothing radical in the speech,
and not on the Currahill speech, no. And not like the Mallow defiance has been labelled that way. He was as far as he ever went there, you see. Now, they came to...
Just before,
yes.
It wasn't that well reported either as the Skibbereen one compared to the other ones.
The strange thing, 'twas reported at the time in newspapers, but not by later biographers. Because all my long life now, if I ever went into a library, I'd pull down a Daniel O'Connell. There's a lot of biographies, and straight away I'd go for the index to see would I get Skibbereen or Currahill. No. A blind spot maybe, or the feeling that there's nothing outside the Spa Hotel in Lucan or something.
I doubt that's...
No. But they weren't enthusiastic about our great meeting, which was a very, very big one. It was. Now,
it was a banquet.
Really, it was very well written up, the banquet was, and it was held in the Temperance Hall in Townsend Street, Skibbereen. Now, there's a little thing to fill in there. The Skibbereen Temperance Society was founded in 1817, and it is accepted as the first in the whole of Europe. The next thing then, they gathered money and progressed a lot, and they built a hall which was completed in 1841. So bear in mind, it was only 2 years old when O'Connell's party were being entertained there.
One of the newest buildings.
It was a new one, and a very well-built one. Now, even allowing for that, and we got a great, very well-written up record of the arrangements within the hall for the dinner. Even allowing for that, they had to extend. So large was the attendance at the dinner, they had to extend out a bit. And the way it was organised, you had a top table and 4 parallel tables down the hall.
Okay.
and they had a special section for ladies. That must have been the custom of the time. The men were the men, and they had ladies and all that. Now, unfortunately, that hall, it was burned in 1854 after only 13 years standing. It was gutted by fire. Yeah. Now, we got a very interesting description. You're talking now about preparing a great banquet before you have any electricity.
Yes.
And it was very, very assiduously described. You had a large, over-the-top table, céad míle fáilte, and they said in the report that that was illuminated by variegated lighting. No. Variegated lighting. I'd had to do a bit of work on that. To get the variegations, as far as I could figure, the only way it could be done would be small oil lamps with coloured globes, blue, green, red, over that and that sort of thing. And if anyone has an interest now, I might throw in interior lighting before electricity. The best thing I saw in recent years was that Scorsese film, Gangs of New York, because you see a grand hotel, very well done up, all on oil. Yeah. And they'd have up the stair, they'd have a little row of small decorative lamps, you know. So it's quite effective. Yeah. Now, the speeching in the speeches delivered at the dinner, I suppose there would be an explanation why they were more eloquent than the ones up on the hill.
Yes.
Yes. So definitely they were of a high standard.
Yeah.
And there was one now I wrote out. I said I must tell the people this because, and I see now copies, the banquet here. Now this man, Daniel Mccarthy presided at the meeting on the hill, but it was Dr. Morris Power presided at the dinner.
Yes.
So that was an alteration in it. And of course he got up. Dr. Power got up before and he found addressing the gathering. There is always, I suppose, the feeling that a man is not a prophet in his own town. And maybe that was in his head, but what he said was incredible. And this sentence now, if you can bear with me. He looked down the hall and, of course, saw many of the people he went to school with, because he was a Skibbereen man, through and through. And Dr. Power now was born the other side of the river from Corrahill, a little downstream in the townland of Dealish. Dealish, just right beside the river out there. He had received a very fine education. He was sent to Stonyhurst in England, and then he went and did medicine in New York, and he married an heiress whose father was a justice of the United States Supreme Court. So he did. So he did well. He did well. Though since that happy period, many changes had come over Skibbereen. Many of her noble sons had sank into the grave with their hopes and prospects blighted. Yet, when he saw the spirit-stirring scenes of that day, he felt the delights of former times throng around him, and he thought that he breathed again the air of life's fairy morning. Now, that is brilliant. He's using fairy there as an adjective. He's talking about that river and those hills. They're still the same. Yep. They don't change at all. And most likely, the day on Corrahill, he may have climbed that as a boy with his friends. And it was definitely to a very high standard. Now, that was the man who was comfortably elected to the seat at Westminster after the death of the Liberator. And he held it for 4 years. Yes, Dr. Power.
At this stage, O'Connell was MP for Cork.
Oh, he was, yeah, he was, sorry. He was MP. And of course, I forgot to tell you, when Daniel O'Connell rose on Corrahill, he was 68 years old, but he was still very vital. And those who knew him well at the time said he hadn't aged at all in 20 years. But he had a terrible run down in his health after that, of course. And he died with the seat in, and there was a by-election, and Dr. Power was elected to replace him. Yeah, that was it, all right.
Back at the banquet, kind of, it was in a temperance hall.
Oh, yes.
But it wasn't quite temperate, was it?
No. Well, now, the paradox, of course, they were serving wines and champagne in what was built as a temperance hall. I mean, well, I have been thinking about that, and in point of fact, I would say when the site was being decided for the Monster Rally, the business of the dinner had to be covered too, and it was the only decent indoor floor space that I think. There were hotels, but they catered for overnight travellers, and you wouldn't be able to seat that many people in them. So I would say that the Temperance Hall had as big an importance in selecting the site as Corrahill or anything, because that had to be done, you know.
Was a space to hold a banquet afterwards.
Oh, yes, that's right. Now, another little thing. It wasn't free, by the way. No.
What?
No, it was... It was nothing like the $100 a plate dinners or the Governor Smith Memorial Dinner every year in New York that way. There was a charge of 6 shillings per plate, and it was put on by the woman, Mrs. Hegarty, who was running the Beecher Arms Hotel. She got it. Now, you'd wonder what was 6 shillings in 1843. Well, one way you could measure it was it would have paid the Catholic rent for 6 years.
Yeah. So
6 shillings, 6 years, you know. So
something an ordinary person
it would. And I yeah. So that's it, all right. Yeah.
And I remember you were telling me at one stage that what happened to the platform that...
Oh, yes. The platform had to be dismantled, of course. And there were horses there for the purpose of taking it, awaiting their drivers, and they must have been delayed in town because some of the horses were put in the pound. Now, that doesn't sound as bad as it is, because a horse that time would be watered and fed properly until he would be redeemed from the pound. And that was in one of the letters, all right. One of the letters written in, because there were a lot of critical letters written in as well, you see.
That a lot of people took timbers and things as well from the platform.
Well, no, not that, no. They were delayed. They were delayed. Oh, no, not at all. In point of fact now, you see, that you mentioned that about the behaviour of the crowd.
Yes.
Now, this isn't from anyone. This is from one of the dissenting letters. No, it is here. He gives out about this, that, and the other thing, but this is his last statement, a local man who wrote in about a week after. It should be honestly borne in mind that there never was a more orderly or well-conducted assembly of people. And if they were allowed the free exercise of their reason and excluded from the deliberate, reckless villainy that is leading them to expect what their deceivers know to be impossible, the material is in them for becoming equal to English or Scotch men in all things and superior to many. I picked it out because he wanted to make that clear, having found fault with other arrangements in it, you know. Yes. No, it was a very successful meeting, and as I say, the campaign remained in high gear until Clontarf, and then it turned altogether. That's it. It turned.
Clontarf, of course, was prescribed.
Yes, Clontarf was prescribed, and then what happened, of course, and O'Connell conceded. He called it off. He called off the meeting, And then Peel was losing patience with them, and someone said, we'll have to move against O'Connell. So they brought a prosecution for incitement, and they got a conviction in that, and it involved a year in prison and a fine of £2,000 from the Liberator. But by a narrow writ of the House of Lords, the sentence and the fine were quashed. In modern language, that would be an appeal to the House of Lords was upheld. Yeah. But he was in it for a month or two, I think, and it certainly damaged his health terribly.
I mean, as you're saying, he's late 60s.
Oh, well, he was. He was a man of 68, and there was only 4 years to his death. And he wasn't able to cope with it.
Shortly after that, of course, the Great Famine.
The Great Famine, the two people in Westminster who immediately discovered and decided the enormity of what was happening. One was Robert Peel, fair dues to him. He was a very practical individual, and also Daniel O'Connell. Any other of the members didn't have any idea, mainly because both Peel and O'Connell knew the countryside and how vulnerable people were for this thing. Now, nobody could have imagined it would last for 3 seasons, but 1 season was bad enough. And there were many minor famines, and in an earlier one, there was a few British journalists trying to discredit Daniel O'Connell, made out he was a bad landlord and sent over people discovering the condition of his tenants. And you know who they were? People who were evicted from other places. He gave them some bit. Yeah. And there was a story. No, he was a good landlord, as his family were, really. But this was an ecological crisis, which of course destroyed many, and in a way destroyed the landlords too, because a lot of the estates became encumbered. Yep. And into debt after it, you see.
So O'Connell didn't survive long, kind of. Can you maybe say a little bit about his death?
Well, now, Daniel O'Connell had a quintessentially Irish death. In this way, it was on foreign soil. Wilde, of infamy, died in Paris. James Joyce died in Zurich, I think, in obscurity. And Daniel O'Connell in Genoa in Italy in controversy. That's the way. He was never more controversial than the time he died. It was a typical Irish death. He left his heart to Rome and his remains to Ireland, of course. And I must say, his monument in Glasnevin is the largest there is. And another one, I only found out this lately, Ireland's main street, and one of the widest in the world, is named for him, O'Connell Street. It had been Sackville Street. And when Foley's monument at the bottom of that, when the foundation stone was being laid for the monument of O'Connell in 1866, about 20 years after his death, it was the largest political group ever recorded in Irish history, just for the laying of the stone, which is a measure of how he was held in his afterlife.
Yeah. And a huge funeral when the body was brought home, there was a big...
Oh, yes.
Yeah, big demonstration.
Sure, of course, yeah. And I mean, anyone you go into the vault in Glasnevin there, and it's something to see, really, and it has a massive tower. And certainly, in the matter of monuments and commemorations, there's another one on the square in Ennis, his monument, because he represented Clare. That was his influential first seat in the Commons that he could take after emancipation. So that he's an enormous figure in Irish history, there's no doubt.
Maybe we'll finish up, Gerald, with you might tell us there are a couple of local connections with the O'Connell family in Skibbereen.
Yes, yeah. Now, in my own youth, I knew a man, and oddly enough, nobody ever called him Mr. O'Connell, nor he was Daniel Joseph. He was known as the O'Connell, or O'Connell of Killeena. he was a great-grandson of the Liberator. And his aunt, who was a granddaughter of the Liberator, was married to Downes, a solicitor here in Skibbereen, who lived in Norton, which now the county council are in up there, Norton Cottage. And this young Daniel Joseph, he was born in Middleton. He came as an apprentice to his aunt's husband, and then the Downes had great misfortune. A lot of their family died, and he took over that practice, and he took over Downes' practice and became an estate agent. And then he must have had an official position because he was interned for a while in the 1920s up in Lissanewig during the Troubles. Oh, yeah. Interned, but he was a gentleman all through, no violence, nothing whatever. And my last memory of him, he was driving a Napoleon trap from Killena. That was burned also, but was rebuilt in the 1920s. Yeah. And it cost so much to rebuild it that there was a question in the House of Commons asked about the cost, because the rebuilt Killena was like a French chateau. Yeah. And that was the one he occupied. He had a lovely pony and trap, and he used to publicly support the Farmers' Party at local elections in that Clownathalon. Yeah. We had a deputy here, Patrick O'Driscoll, under that banner at one time. We had, yeah. So that, and he died quite suddenly while in the bank in town. Really? He got a seizure. 77 was the man's age. Yeah, gentleman.
So very good, Gerald. Thank you for that fascinating ramble.